Thank you all for joining us. My name is Ian Volner, and I'm a journalist and critic. I write about architecture, design, and urbanism. And I'm here today with a distinguished group of panelists to discuss a very fraught topic. What happens when the rent comes due? As we all know, the country's housing market could well be at a cliff, a crossroads. We don't quite know. As many as 20 million Americans could face eviction from renter housing in the coming months as eviction moratoria that have been imposed at the state, federal, and municipal levels are set to expire, as potentially congressional support for extended unemployment and other emergency assistance dries up, and as the global pandemic, which caused the current economic slowdown, lingers. Here to tease out the possibilities of both what could happen and what should happen are, at present, three, hopefully one more coming, specialists in various sectors of the housing field. Not yet with us, but hopefully coming in a moment. Daryl Carter, the founder of Avanath Management. Daryl is a specialist in the acquisition and management of low-cost and subsidized housing. His company now manages some 10,000 of such units across the country. Also, Sacajawea Hall. Saki is a feminist and activist, and the founder and leader of Co-op Jackson, an organization that advocates new cooperative models in various economic sectors, including housing. Leilani Farha is the global director of The Shift, an advocacy group fighting for housing as a human right. She is also featured in the recent documentary Push, which discusses her attempts to change public perceptions of housing. Lastly, Tara Raghuveer is the Homes Guarantee Campaign Director for People's Action. She is also an activist for climate justice and other important causes. And with these four, I have the rudimentary sort of beginnings of, I think, four basic scenarios. Without Daryl yet among us, I'll throw the first one to the group. Hopefully he'll come and chime in subsequently. The first one, let's imagine a condition of something almost like stasis. That is, some congressional support continues for the unemployed. Some of the eviction moratoria are extended. We've already seen Pennsylvania's extended from ending this month to the end of August. How do we like the prospects of the conventional tenant-landlord model if things simply stay on the level as they have been without collapse, without a knock-on effect possibly going all the way up to the banks that issue landlords their mortgages? I give this one to all of you.
Well, I think my American counterparts should weigh in first. As a Canadian, I don't think I'm as well placed to answer that question. So I'm gonna let Saki and Tara weigh in first, if you don't mind, not to put you on the spot.
I mean, I can speak a little bit to that. You know, I think that ideally there would be a response by all of the states that extend a moratorium. And unfortunately, the system that we have and I think like the negative aspects of it are being displayed during this pandemic because there hasn't been a federal response. They refuse to have a federal response, and not only in terms of the response to COVID-19 and health initiatives, but the other things that are being affected because of that, and the ripple effect of that also call for something federal. And so, what we see, especially here in the South, I'm in Jackson, Mississippi. We're in the Deep South, where there's little to no protections in terms of housing to begin with. But, places have already started. And the moratorium ended July 1st. And so, unfortunately, if we do see them being extended, it's going to be extended in a limited amount of places. And, typically places that have been, more progressive, and places that we already see a level of protection for people in their homes. And so, I think that we have to be continuing to push and making the claim of housing as a human right in order for that to be a demand coming out of communities. And at the same time, moratoriums aren't enough. If at the end of 6 months, your landlord is able to say, okay, now you owe me 6 months plus this coming month, then what position does that leave people in? How many people can actually afford to back pay their rent, over a certain amount of time? I mean, people have been paying who can't pay. They've been taking from other places in order to pay. People have been paying half. But, for us and the national alliances that we're a part of, we really feel like rent needs to be not only postponed, but there needs to be a freeze.
In the course of your advocacy, Saki, and Tara as well, have any of you had any contact with actual landlords? I guess part of what I'm curious about, again, under this imagined scenario of a kind of plateau, things keeping on as they are, with a great deal of rent non-payment or only partial payment, moratoria being extended in certain places, support at the federal level at best only partial. Are landlords actually going to be able to keep on as they have been? How sustainable is the model itself? It should be mentioned that as grim as things are in many respects, and there has been spikes in evictions, especially in those jurisdictions where the moratoria have been repealed, as for example in Michigan, both Milwaukee and Detroit. That notwithstanding, rent payment has actually been surprisingly high in other areas, though that plainly reflects the fact that people have received pandemic unemployment assistance and other special forms of assistance. Do we think that could be enough to keep landlords afloat, or is the whole system perhaps heading for a serious drop-off?
I can jump in. I mean, I think, Ian, my answer to your question, your first and second question are kind of combined. I'm not optimistic about any of the scenarios we're staring at, whether there's stasis and, some federal support is extended or not. The reality, I live in Kansas City, Missouri, not dissimilar from Mississippi. And our reality pre-COVID was very, very few tenant protections. And our reality within COVID is that our moratorium expired on May 31st. And since then, we've seen a huge spike in evictions, about 1,000 people evicted in the county where I live. But I will be clear, even before the moratorium had expired, landlords who were feeling the pressure of this moment had already started evicting people informally outside of the council, and in ways that we would consider, of course, illegal. And I think what we can expect, even if there's some sort of stasis, and even if Congress takes some minimal action in the next couple of weeks, that property owners feeling that squeeze will take matters into their own hands, as they have already been doing, and more tenants will be forced from their homes, whether or not it's through the legal process. So I think I'm in 100% agreement with Saki that the only real answer all along has been rent cancellation and mortgage cancellation, and then other forms of relief for property owners to try to stabilize. But those forms of relief should have always and should still come with conditions that guarantee that if they're going to be bailed out by the government, that they then are agreeing to a set of tenant protections that last well into the future.
Well, here with a not necessarily a rosier, but certainly a different perspective is Daryl. Right on cue, too. Daryl, we are discussing the sustainability or the prospective sustainability of the conventional landlord-tenant model, with the squeeze presently tightening on renters and the possibility of increasing non-payment. You, in the affordable sector, are you not somewhat inured from the worst of a potential non-payment situation, because, of course, so many of your renters receive subsidies? How are things looking? Do you rate the prospects of economic sustainability for the near term?
Well, good morning first to everyone, or good afternoon, I guess. I'm on the West Coast, so it's still morning. Collections have been very, very high across most apartment communities, and certainly ours has as well. About 40% of our residents are either project-based Section 8 or Section 8 voucher holders. And certainly there's some support for those residents that happen in the national, the first CARES Act. And so we continue to see very strong payments there. And, we see it across our portfolio. And I would say that certainly the enhanced benefits have helped. But I also think that, we provide very quality, affordable homes that people value very, very much. And the unfortunate thing that we've learned is that some residents are paying rent and don't have enough food to eat. And so we're trying to sustain our residents by, certainly we've made donations, we've referred people to food banks and the like. And so, that's the situation that's happening. I don't think, and there's a perception that, at least what we see, that people are going to game the system relative to a lot of communities that have foreclosure, have eviction bans and things like that. We find that when people can't pay rent or they've lost their job, what we're seeing is they just simply are coming to us and say, look, we're going to live with a friend and we'd like to get out of our lease, and we let them out of the lease. That's what we're seeing.
Looking over your shoulder to the non-subsidized, non-regulated sector of the market, where perhaps they might be more exposed to a continued economic downturn, do you think it's possible that some number of landlords, a large number of landlords, a wave, could be in a position where they would be in danger of defaulting on their mortgages? If rent non-payments escalate, where does that leave the landlords?
Well, I would say you look at a couple of different categories. Our properties, we have institutional equity partners via equity funds that we have raised, that we deployed to acquire our apartments. And we're probably, 55% leverage. So our overall portfolio debt service coverage is over 2 to 1. So it would take a considerable number of defaults for that to happen. And I would say this, that a lot of institutionally owned real estate is capitalized in a similar manner. I don't see, there are certainly owners that have done, 80% loans where they may be up against that. But I do think that's, there are a lot of lessons learned from the last downturn. And I think more people and more apartment, particularly large institutional owners, have a fair amount of leeway between, just a lot of defaults. I do not think that we will see the same level of defaults in the apartment community that exists, for instance, in retail or hotel or some other sectors.
Can I jump in? I think that this is when we have to, bring in the banks, and we have to, I think begin talking about or expand talking about the demand on the banks, and Daryl raised previously with 2008, so many people with foreclosures happening. There was a housing justice movement that really took the banks to task. And so I think that ahead of time, we could be ahead of the curve by demanding that the banks, give homeowners, period. And then you have, small real estate homeowners who may have 2 or 3 homes that they're renting, let alone the big apartment buildings. And, what we end up seeing is the banks being bailed out every single time. And it is actually more helpful to everybody on the ground if the banks are made to also have a pause or a cancellation, and to give some leeway to the people who are owning, who can then give relief to the people who are renting.
If I might jump, oh, sorry, Ian. You're on mute, by the way, Ian.
Go ahead.
I was only going to jump in to say a couple things. One, I think it's to echo what Saki was just saying. I guess my concern, without knowing more and all the details in the U.S., my concern is for what happens for the mom and pop landlord. And I don't know what percentage of the rental accommodation in the U.S. is sort of that medium scale, not institutional investors, not institutionally backed in housing, but rather those mom and pops. And what worries me about that is if they are unable to pay their mortgages, then they become prey for those institutional investors, not all of whom are as progressive as Daryl and his group. And so that certainly would be of concern to me. Also of concern are the individual single family homes that might go into foreclosure. And then, and obviously they became prey in 2008 and were prey to institutional investors, which has wreaked havoc and I think increased your homelessness and unaffordability problems in the US. And then lastly, I mean, Daryl himself said, those who are struggling are themselves sort of self-evicting on occasion. And that's really worrying to me. You don't want that to happen, right? That's troubling. Oh, I'm going to go sleep on my neighbor's or friend's or aunt's couch. Well, those are the same people that I talked to in encampments a few months later. And so there's this feeling that stasis isn't, I don't think stasis is good, if that was your original question, Ian. And I was looking at numbers out of Eviction Lab, Matthew Desmond's outfit, and the numbers are looking really bad. In Missouri, for example, the number of eviction notices. So even where there was a moratorium in place, when it was in place, the notices were being sent out as a sort of threat in the midst of a pandemic when people are not paying their rent, not because they're assholes, right? they're struggling. So I think stasis is worrying, at least from my vantage. And lastly, I'll just say that, eviction into homelessness is a violation of human rights. And even those, in quotes, legal evictions, so evictions that go through a legal process and it's for arrears, that still constitutes a violation of international human rights law. And so we have to be mindful of that as we're thinking through sort of how are we going to deal with the situation at hand?
So, oh, sorry, go ahead. Go right ahead, Daryl.
One comment I'd like to make, and I read the book Evicted, and certainly it portrays a very, very, a very dark reality of what happens in some neighborhoods. But I must say that the commentary, there, in my opinion, there is an the actual number of evictions. I mean, I'm going to give you some numbers. We probably filed out of 10,000 apartments, maybe 300 eviction notices last year. Okay. We actually only had 60 evictions in a year, 60 out of 10,000. One of the methodology, and I'm just pointing this out because the Matthew Desmond's, a lot of his research, and I would love to go and have a debate with him, is based on evictions filed. Evictions filed is really just, it is a legal process, and I certainly recognize it is threatening. It is a provocative measure. But the actual number of evictions, I mean, the statistics are really, most of those statistics are on evictions file where the actual number is significantly less. Just a comment on methodology.
I guess part of what we're interested in here is speculating on the near to immediate future, which past performance being no guarantee of future success, it may be worrisome. The fact that evictions historically have been low in many sectors of the market, there's still reasonable concern about what might happen in the present crisis. On that point, and building off of some of your observations, Leilani, a question for you, Saki. if we assume at least a slightly higher degree of instability going forward than Daryl has seen the market, the conventional marketplace, exhibit in the past. If there is some a kind of rising tide of evictions, at least even a moderate one, and some sense that the market is destabilized, Saki, what alternate models might be capable of being pursued in that kind of environment, and what might be the best ways of pursuing? I'll have to unmute, Saki. There you go.
Yeah. So I'm with Cooperation Jackson. We're members of Right to the City, National Alliance, and the Homes for All campaign because we're in the South, and the South is unique in terms of all of its inequalities and white supremacy and how capitalism plays out differently here. We're a part of a Homes for All South coalition as well. And a lot of what we have been talking about and communities have been talking about for a long time is having communities be over commodities. And housing has been commodified, land has been commodified, right? And so one of the things that we have been working on since we started in 2014 is developing a community land trust. So the Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust was something that we knew needed to start in the very, very beginning. The community land trust isn't the end all be all, but it is a legal tool here in the United States so that we can collectively as a community steward our resources. And then on top of that, developing cooperative housing is another thing. A lot of the organizations that are doing renters' rights, renters' justice, housing justice have been successfully building tenant unions. And I think that we, are going to see, and hopefully we'll see more renters organizing themselves and amongst themselves and creating tenant unions so that they are in a better position of being able to negotiate with their landlords, whether it be a small family that owns, one apartment complex or a few homes, or it be, a huge mass property management that's tied to property developers. There are a lot of different alternatives that are being created across the country because we have been in a housing crisis. This is exacerbating a housing crisis, but we've been in a housing crisis in the United States. And so, one of the things that we had talked about ahead of time was like renter strikes. There are rent strikes happening in a number of places. And I think that I think that is a tool, and it can be an effective tool in families not having to feel ashamed and be the only ones. It's a form of solidarity when a whole group of people can say, this is what is going on, we refuse to pay. And a lot of times, what has been advocated because we knew things were coming down the line was that communities organized with each other and actually had conversations, built a relationship if they didn't have one, to negotiate with a property owner or with a landlord. But in so many cases, there is no negotiation with a lot of these big developers, right? And these big management companies. And so the tool of being able to collectively say we are going to withhold our rent during this pandemic, I think is an important one. And it's along the lines of other mass strikes that have been happening, and I think we'll see even more of, whether it's the workers, like workers at Target, or kind of like general mass strikes. We also helped in May launch on May Day, International Workers' Day, People's Strike, which is a national coalition, actually involves some international forces also that are calling for and helping to build mass strikes. And the call was for the first of every month for people to be able to take collective action. And really, it is hard, and I think all the organizations have been thinking about how do we build relationship with homeowners to really bridge the gap between the renter class and people who are homeowners. And I think that includes, Leilani, that includes like small mom and pop landlords, but to be able to bridge that gap, because everybody is hurting. People are constantly trying to figure out how to pay the mortgage. One of my comrades in Miami often likes to say, and I like to repeat it, that you're a homeowner, you're paying, your landlord is the bank, right? You're not scot-free because you actually own your home. And so if there's, I think that there can be in this moment a movement towards solidarity amongst all those groups. And like I said, bringing it to the highest level, which is the bank in addition to the government. But I think that there's a real strong opportunity in this moment for those of us who have been dealing with for decades the injustices around housing that intersects with gender, that intersects with race, under this capitalist model that basically puts profit in terms of housing over people, for there to be power developed on a very grassroots community level basis. So people can be organizing to even negotiate with a landlord who is in distress, for them to be able to take over ownership and purchase the building. We've seen that in several places, including in the Bay Area, without there necessarily being a crisis, but both when there's a crisis and the people are facing eviction, they are saying, give us the first chance at being able to purchase this and manage this collectively ourselves. And then even in other cases, even when the landlord isn't under distress and people aren't facing eviction, there has been pressure built to have those people take over. So really, I think that the root of the solution so that people aren't constantly vulnerable is for people to be able to, if not steward and manage and own their homes collectively, then being able to be in better positions of power and in decision-making positions to be able to have some say over their housing, which is, arguably one of the most important things for anybody and families to be secure.
Sorry, my system has been acting up. I live in New York City, and the last time that we had a wave of cooperative housing launched in the city was almost 25 years ago and more. It was the early 90s, late 80s. There was a kind of conspiracy of coincidence that made that possible, and I don't know that it's imminent now. I guess I'd be interested, I'm interested in anybody else who knows of such models that have succeeded elsewhere. Certainly, different models of cooperative ownership have been popular at various times. But I'm also curious, and perhaps Daryl, you could weigh in on this one. What could be what could turn the gears on the financial side, perhaps to change the orientation of the marketplace away from the ubiquitous renter model towards cooperative housing, either of the type that Saki has worked on in Jackson, or other varieties that you're perhaps more familiar with?
Well, I would say this, that certainly, and I appreciate all the things that Saki said about some of the challenges that people have as renters and a lack of a voice. And one of the things that our company, and I think our industry, has tried to do is to give renters a bigger voice politically. I mean, very often, the reason, in my opinion, we have a housing crisis in this country is because we've not built enough apartments, we've not built enough houses, period. It's an undersupply of inventory is why we have an affordability crisis because of that. And that's, so the question is, what are some of the solutions? And I would say this, that any one of our residents that cannot pay rent, we have provided the mechanisms for them to do a lease modification. And many other companies out there are doing the same thing. I don't think that there's been wholesale, at least amongst the larger owners that I'm familiar with that are part of, for instance, the National Multifamily Housing Council. I think everybody we have been very strongly doing a number of things. One, making sure if someone needs a lease modification, we would do it. And secondly, making sure that our residents that do have challenges we provide them with resources and let them know everything they're that they're eligible for. And so that is, so I do think the industry that many in the industry are very focused on giving their residents a political voice, and B, supporting during this situation. There are certainly situations, and we're involved in one right now, which is a housing cooperative that was created in the 70s, primarily African American. It was affiliated with an African American church in San Francisco called Freedom West. And Freedom West is a cooperative, and the really great location, really close to City Hall. And now, they've owned it and the descendants of the original founders still own it. It's almost 400 units. And now they're at a point where the original development is almost 50 years old, and they need to have a redevelopment strategy that we've been working with them on to implement. And, the great thing is where there are 400 apartments today, the zoning allows it to build 1,600 today. So they've created great wealth in owning, which is fantastic to see. I think that the ownership, I think if you were to, my view on the cooperative model, I think it still requires professional management. I think that, technology is increasingly important. I mean, one of the things as an owner that we're doing today is making sure our properties are as safe as they possibly can be. We do constant sanitizing of common areas. We are, doing things. And these are not easy things to do where we have, our maintenance staff, they're my heroes today. They are taking considerable personal risk in going in apartments and maintaining them in a very, very high quality.
Ian, so, can I jump in here for a second?
Sure.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Daryl, but just before you go too far away from the financial stuff, I wanted to just weigh in on that, and I was worried you were moving us beyond that, and it would seem weird for me to jump in. But I just wanted to address two things: the affordability issue and why the U.S. and countries around the world are in the housing crisis. I can't agree with you that it's because of a complete undersupply of housing. It's an undersupply of particular types of housing for particular groups of people. But, go to any major urban center, look up, and what will you see? You will see skyscrapers that are meant for higher end incomes or it's investor driven housing basically. And then when those are standing vacant in the midst of a pandemic, and those are Airbnb or they are just simply owned by investors who have no intention and never had any intention of living there, when they're standing vacant, we look up and we don't say those should be made available for people in low income or people who are living in homelessness, because we have a discriminatory perception of who that housing is for and who should live there. And so I don't agree with you that there's an undersupply generally of housing. I think there has been a big step back worldwide from the development of deeply affordable and social housing in favor of investor-driven housing. And that has actually helped to drive up the cost of housing. Corrupt money that lands into real estate, 80% of corrupt money lands in real estate. That is to say, 80% of corrupt money lands in real estate, and that is driving the cost of housing up. So it's not so simple to say this is a supply and demand issue.
Well, I will.
I'm glad that Leilani said that, because one of the things that I wanted to be able to point out is that in New York City, Picture the Homeless went around and literally did a count. They literally did a housing count in New York City in the boroughs, and they counted the number of vacant, usable properties and places that could house people would actually house the homeless population in New York City. And that is huge. And so I'm glad that you pointed that out and the other things that you did, because I think while you are right, Daryl, there has not been an investment in building affordable housing units. There, at the same time, there is housing that's available because the market and people who are in positions to be able to make investments have decided and made a choice to make investments in property that is not affordable for the majority of working people in this country.
I will
presumably sorry, go ahead, Daryl.
That, we invest in housing that is affordable. Our average rent across our portfolio of almost 11,000 apartment units is about $1,200 a month. And that includes Los Angeles, that includes New York, that includes the coastal markets. What I would say is this, and we do it for profit, okay? And I make no apologies about that whatsoever. What I will say is one of the fundamental issues is to build a housing unit in California, and let's take some of the best affordable housing developers in California. The cost to build an apartment unit is $700,000 a unit, okay? It costs that to build in New York. The 2x4s don't know if it's affordable or if it's market rate. It's the same 2x4, the same plumbing systems and things like that. It costs way too much to build a housing unit in this country, and a lot of it is the regulatory challenges. I mean, it takes someone in California 5 to 7 years at a cost of probably $7 to $10 million before they get the approval to build one apartment unit. So it is a combination of things. I do not dispute the fact that most new things that are built for the high end, because that's all that can be done. Now, our business model is different. We acquire things primarily in communities of color that have been basically abandoned or underinvested in. We buy them very favorably. We renovate, make them nice, and we rent. We can afford to make money and rent to people that, they're affordable. And primarily 70% of our residents are residents of color, and we provide a very quality home to them. Now, the reality of it is what we do, which, our portfolio is $2.5 billion. If I had more capital, I could be at $10 billion. And the fact is, getting the challenge it takes to get capital to flow in many of these communities is the challenge. And I can tell you, we make money and we do it, I think, better than anyone. So the point of capital is absolutely true. And we have to figure out ways to give more incentives to invest in many of the communities that need housing, where we can take things and then make them affordable. And
Can I just jump in again?
Sorry, go ahead, Leilani.
I just want to jump in and say, one of the things that's necessary is to grapple with who is driving the housing market in the U.S. and other countries. And is it governments? Are governments actually in control of what's happening in housing across the country? Or is it institutional actors? Is it the developers? Is it the construction industry, et cetera? Or are they in bed together? And one of the things that worries me, and I would love to hear from Saki and Tara on this, what really worries me is when we start looking at other models like cooperatives or land trusts. I think there's a lot of good that can be done with those models. And if you look at Latin America, they have a very vibrant cooperative housing movement, or have had. It's under siege as well. And in parts of Southern Africa as well. What worries me is that residential real estate development and its links to finance are so embedded in the financial structures of our countries. They represent a huge percentage of our GDPs. 20% of most economies are rooted in this sector. So when we start trying, and I know because I have worked with governments from around the world, when I start talking about dismantling, and I am not anti-capitalism, I am not saying the solution is only social housing. People want to live in the private rental market. I believe strongly actually in the private rental market. I'm a bit of an odd bird that way. But when I start saying, well, we need to dismantle, let's get rid of the tax benefits of real estate investment trusts that all of these financial actors are using. Let's get rid of those tax benefits. Let's create hostile environments where we give tenants 5 to 7 year rent freezes, like they're doing in Barcelona and in Berlin. Let's have a law like Denmark does that actually says any new unit that's bought cannot be refurbished for profit. I get very big pushback from government on these suggestions. Why? Because I'm talking about changing the way our financial system is working, what our GDP is based in. And that is like quite considered quite radical. So then I asked Saki and Tara, okay, so what do we do? How do we get these really important people-driven, people-centered models scaled up?
Daryl, would you care to weigh in on that one? I'd like to consider yet another potential nightmare scenario, but I'd like to hear if you have any insights on alternate. Right, if we give Daryl the floor, I'd just be curious to hear from her for a moment.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I think there's a fundamental, we're having conversations at different levels. And I think Daryl's an important voice here, but the reality is whenever we're talking to one provider of housing or one owner, as progressive as their policies may be, as well as they may treat their tenants, the reality is the goodwill of landlords is not public policy. And public policy is really what's missing here. Intervention on behalf of the government is really what's missing here. So I want to pick up on one thing that Daryl said, which is that in places like California, it's simply not affordable to build housing and provide supply of housing that is truly affordable and truly meets the need on the demand side. There's no disputing that, right? I'm not a finance expert, but I've looked at some of those balance sheets and that is correct. So then the question is, there are people for whom there's a demand for housing that is not a profitable model for the for-profit sector. The government should step in to provide housing for people who cannot be provided for by the for-profit sector. And I actually think there's a huge role for government there. And that's a place where we can get out of these questions of where do we find the money. In the US, we've just printed $2 trillion in the last couple of months. The money is there, right? We could go construct millions of units of social housing in this country today if we decided to do it. And that could be a huge job creation tool, as it has been in the history of the US and in many other countries across the world. And I think we just have to acknowledge that there's a incentive mismatch at a certain in a certain slice of the market. The incentive for the renter is keep a roof over my head. The incentive for the owner or the builder is make a profit. And that works for some people, right? I'm able to afford the property where I live, so the incentives for me and my landlord are matched well. But there is a certain slice of the market where those incentives do not line up, and they never will. And we have to consider the role for the government to intervene and be a provider of housing that is permanently and in perpetuity off of the private market and not for profit.
Building on that, sorry, Daryl, do you want to have one last closing remark on this one?
You're absolutely right. And the government should play a bigger role. I mean, for instance, 40% of our portfolio is Section 8, which means that people pay 30% of their income regardless of it. We need to significantly expand the Section 8 program. For every resident that gets it, there are about 8 that qualify that can't get it. And the waiting list is 10 years. We should absolutely appropriate significantly more. That would start addressing it. I 100% agree with you.
Turning us now to the crisis at hand, and this one I put to you, Leilani. Let's imagine, and as Daryl's observed, this this may not be the greatest likelihood of the several that are now before us, but what if the absolute worst happens and evictions really do spike, not to a moderate degree, but to a severe one? In considering these alternate models, these alternate futures that we could pursue, obviously the immediate task at hand would then be simply to try to staunch the bleeding. What are the kind of moral and political arguments that have to be made? And what, I understand, of course, yours is kind of international purview, so maybe you can speak about how this works abroad as well. What are the legal instruments available in the event that evictions really do get going at a terrifying clip?
There we go. That's not an easy question to answer. I actually think what's happening in the US right now is super interesting, and that the advocates and legislators many are on the right track and doing exactly what needs to be done, albeit it has to be done quickly. I think that the way forward requires a recognition at legislative level that housing is a fundamental human right. And while, I'd love to see the US ratify international instruments that say housing is a human right, that's way down the road. I know that Congresswoman AOC has suggested that the US go down that road, but that's going to take some time. But there is a movement afoot that is leading the US in that direction. Congresswoman Omar, who we're going to be hearing from at 1:00, as I understand it, has already taken a really important step in her Homes for All Act. And in that act, which she's put forward as a bill, she embeds the notion of housing as a human right and not as some aspirational goal. What she does is she makes it very practical, and she says this is what it's going to look like in the United States of America if we take housing as a human right seriously. There are other movements afoot. In California, there is a movement, an amendment being proposed to the Constitution of California so that the Constitution would recognize the right to housing. And what's so amazing, that was, first of all, that comes from grassroots movement. It was born of the Moms for Housing movement out there. Those of you will probably all know the women who occupied the financialized house, and then they undertook a whole series of actions, legal and now legislative. And there is very wide support for that amendment, and not just with Democrats, which is so interesting. A huge percentage of Republicans support the amendment of California's Constitution to include the right to housing. And then, we see things happening. We saw before the pandemic, things happening in the state of New York with Governor Cuomo saying, really ensuring that tenants have better protections than they've had in a long time. These sorts of things that are going on. Tara's group, I know, is doing really important work as well. I think that that's the way forward, because without some fundamental recognized human right, we don't have the framework or the foundation to launch really good policy. And what is unique about a human rights framework, especially a legislative one, is that it builds in an accountability mechanism. And we have to be able to hold all governments at city level, state level, and nationally accountable to their human rights obligations. So I think that's an unusual answer for, emergency, people being evicted, rising homelessness. But I really think that we need to use this as an opportunity to start building some really fundamental things, and human rights is a foundational step.
Yeah.
Tara, did you have a remark on that?
Thing I want to add, but I want to let Tara, who hasn't been able to speak as much as the rest of us, go if you have something.
I think I tend to agree with that. We've worked very closely with Representative Omar and many of the congressional representatives who have introduced what I consider a new floor for progressive housing policy in the last several months. We worked really closely with her office on the Housing for All bill, which borrows from ideas that are embedded in our vision for the world that we want, which is the homes guarantee. When we went and asked public housing residents, unhoused people, tenants of private landlords across the country what they wanted and what their vision was, actually they had some trouble, Leilani, understanding and wrapping their minds around the frame of housing as a human right, because it's so counterintuitive in the American economy where housing has been so deeply entrenched as a commodity. So we decided that the first project that we wanted to take on was actually imagining what we meant when we said housing is a human right in the context of the American economy. And out of that, we grew the vision for the homes guarantee, which calls for building 12 million units of social housing. It calls for expanded tenant protections. It calls for an end to real estate and land speculation. And that, I think, is our vision for what the future could look like, and a fundamental shift around the idea of housing as a commodity to housing as a human right as part of that. And I agree with you. I think that's actually the vision that we need to bring to a crisis moment like this. We can call for cancel rent, but at the same moment, we must call for a homes guarantee, because this is the richest country in the history of the world, and we can and we must ensure that everyone is safely, securely, and sustainably housed.
To that point, Tara, my last question, because we do have Representative Omar joining us in a scant 9 minutes. When we consider the immediate electoral political situation, let's be at any one of the scenarios we've sketched out, either relative stasis in the months to come, some increasing instability, or potential total disaster. What do you think the implications are for the coming election? And if the crisis continues to extend beyond the election into the term of the next president, what do you think the responses could be under each prospective administration?
I think that we do have to look at this crisis as deepening and it's impending. And I agree with Leilani and Tara. I'm a big advocate and have worked, within international and domestic human rights. And at the same time, I'm going to throw this in because I think it does have implications for, all of this election stuff. I think what will happen when people are in positions of being very desperate, what I hope will happen is that we begin to bring up models of housing defense, as has been done in the past, both during the Depression, again during the 2008 housing crisis, being able to defend people staying in their homes, being able to put people back in their homes, and even, as was raised with moms in the Bay Area, housing occupations. It is, I think that it is actually going to take that and being able to make the moral argument about housing as a human right, and for everybody to be able to be housing, especially during a pandemic where it can literally cost you your life, I think is important. And at the same time, you can't make a moral appeal to an immoral system. And basically the housing policy and the housing system coupled with this idea of free markets and capitalism is an immoral system. And so I needed to be able to throw that in, because I think that the actual action that people have taken and can take and need to take, I think when it comes down to how, I don't think that we can sit by and watch people literally be made houseless. And the response of creating jobs, the response of, this idea of whatever welfare is considered to be, none of those things are being put out on the table in a real way that helps support people staying in their homes, or help support people even being able to move to something maybe that is more affordable compared to what they had before. And so the direct action, I think, is going to hopefully be something that people realize is a step that we need to take and need to further.
I'd like to give the last word to Tara. Tara, you had a wonderful breakdown on Twitter of the combined Biden-Sanders plank on housing, in which you rated its various stipulations. It looks like net it ranked maybe a B+. Do you like where we're headed? Possibly, do you feel cautiously optimistic on the electoral front?
The thing I feel optimistic about is the undeniable growth in renter power across the country and the resurgence, to Saki's point, of movements that have historically won. The movement to take back the land in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis was very successful in helping defend people against foreclosures at scale. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm not optimistic about the ideas included in that task force's recommendations, to be honest with you. They are very rooted in the world as it is and not very imaginative. And they're certainly not reaching the level of scale that we need to get to. And I think the reality is American politics has, for a long time, ignored housing, and that's not by accident. It's by a conspiracy of the profiteers. And the next president, whoever they might be, must take seriously housing and guaranteeing housing as a human right if we are ever to get out of this economic crisis.
Thank you, Tara. That seems like an appropriately pointed point to end on, and a nuanced one at that. I'd like to welcome to the pseudo stage now my friend and sometime journalist Greg Lindsay, the Director of Applied Research at NewCities, to introduce our next and I hope very much engaging guest. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Volner. Thank you all of my panelists. Really appreciate it. I just want to take this opportunity to, again, thank you all so much for this incredibly lively discussion. And two quick things. In a moment, I'd like to herd you all over virtually over to Zoom for our closing keynote with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and also to remind all of you that that's not all for today. There's also a workshop hosted by the National Multifamily Housing Council on many of these issues that we've just discussed, and so all attendees are welcome to join for that to really get hands-on in dealing with future housing issues. So once again, a thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Mr. Volner, for hosting. And again, I would encourage all of you to head on over to other links to see Congresswoman Omar in just a moment. Thank you all so much.